When on a cold February morning the whole world watched the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, no one imagined that 1 year and 3 months later we would be watching the invasion in the other direction, into the territory of the Russian Federation. The Russian triumph in the capture of Bakhmut after 9 months of assaults was overshadowed by the humiliation of the invasion of Russian territory by Russian opposition forces. A few days later, a dam on the Dnieper River was destroyed at Nowa Kakhovka, which caused a devastating environmental, economic and social disaster, which also diametrically changed the operational situation. Let's take a look at the current situation. On the map. Consider leaving a like if you enjoyed the video to aid the algorithm. A brief disclaimer at the outset. The visualization of events in this episode covers the period up to the blowing up of the Kakhovka Dam. Immediately afterwards, there were significant developments on the Zaporozhye front, where the Ukrainians engaged Leopard tanks, among others. As Konrad Muzyka points out, time will tell whether the current actions are the main thrust of the Ukrainian armed forces in the ongoing counteroffensive. These events will be covered in the next episode of the Mapped series. Kharkiv direction. The front line near Kharkiv remains frozen. Most of the attacks again took place near Masyutivka, which, contrary to Russian reports, remains under Ukrainian control. Ukrainian bloggers claim that Moscow has deployed its own Storm Z units in the area. These units comprise convicts who have not previously fought under Wagner's PMC banner. As such, the Storm Z were formed to counter Wagner, reduce the number of personnel Wagner could recruit, and thus limit its influence on the battlefield. Yet the most interesting event in this direction took place not in the Kharkiv Oblast, but in the Belgorod region, where on May 22nd, the Russian Volunteer Corps carried out a raid on the border crossing at Kozinka. Not only did they take the crossing, but they also advanced towards Glotovo, while smoke could be seen even over Góra Podol, some 7 kilometers from the border. If Góra Podol was indeed reached, the attackers were about 10 kilometers from the Belgorod 22 nuclear storage facility. Following the incursion, the area under the control of the Russian Volunteer Corps was declared demilitarized. The Ukrainians denied involvement in the attack, while Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu claimed that the attackers had lost more than 70 men in the raid. However, our sources on the Ukrainian side say that the Russian Volunteer Corps lost less than 10 men. It should be remembered that although the RVC is in theory a unit made up of Russians, the core operations are organized and directed by Ukrainian military intelligence. The attack was light in terms of equipment. The Russian Volunteer Corps, or RVC, sent at least 2 tanks, an armored personnel carrier, and several other lightly armored vehicles, such as US-supplied MRAPs. But this was enough to shock the Russian political military establishment and social media. It led to bizarre scenes in which the Chief of Staff of the Russian Ground Forces, Colonel General Alexander Lapin, personally led Russian troops into action near Glotovo. More than a week after the raid on the Kozinka border crossing, the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Freedom of Russia Legion carried out another raid on the 1st of June, this time on Nowoyata Włożanka and towards Szebekino. The latter is only 30 kilometers from Belgorod, compared to more than 80 kilometers from Kozinka. This latest attack has therefore brought these units much closer to Belgorod. It is clear then that the Russian command and regional administration have learned no lessons from previous invasions, as shown by the ease with which the insurgents entered Russia. These attacks are of a bullying nature. They are designed to provoke Moscow into responding to a growing threat to its territorial integrity, and then to force it to disperse its forces. The first attack was probably a test to see how the Russians would react. It was also relatively small, involving around 300 troops. Given that the Ukrainians had still not been driven out of Nowoyata Włożanka by Sunday the 4th of June, this means that either the defenses in the area were very weak, and/or the Ukrainians had planned a larger force for this attack. Rochan believes that sustaining such an operation for several days is beyond the capabilities of Ukrainian intelligence. It is therefore likely that regular Ukrainian military formations were involved in the current attack, making the sustainability of the Ukrainian presence near Belgorod much greater than in the Kozinka raid. If this is the case, the attack is part of a wider state strategy to destabilize Russia and increase Kyiv's chances of launching a successful counteroffensive. Of course, we do not know how long Kyiv will be able to keep its forces on the other side of the border, but it is not out of question that the Ukrainians will push deeper into Belgorod if the situation allows. If that happens, the likelihood of Russian nuclear threats will undoubtedly increase. Luhansk direction. The situation in the Luhansk region has not changed significantly, although the Ukrainians are believed to have successfully conducted offensive operations near Serhivka. In this part of Ukraine, the center of gravity is around Bilohorivka, where, according to Roman Vlasenko, head of the Severodonetsk administration, most of the Russian troops have been deployed. However, despite this concentration of units and several weeks of attempts to break through Ukrainian lines, the Russians have made no confirmed territorial gains. The village remains under Ukrainian control. In early June, a Ukrainian source reported that Ukrainian forces had liberated more than 9 square kilometers in the Svatove region. The Ukrainians were said to have pushed the Russians across the Zherebets River and captured Serhivka, while the Russians had set up their defenses in Rayhorodoka. Russian sources did not confirm these events, while Ukrainian bloggers confirmed that the village remained under Kyiv's control. In contrast, the Russians have made several attempts to storm Novoselivske, but these failed. Similarly, there were no developments near Makivka, Ploszczanka and Czerwonopopivka. Russian assaults on Terny, Torske and Nevske were equally unsuccessful. Now, a quick note that this episode is based on the analysis of Rochan Consulting. Rochan is an independent defense center that publishes the Ukraine Conflict Monitor report, which provides an in-depth and unique analysis of the battlefield. You can purchase access to Rochan's weekly reports on Substack for only $7 per month via the link in the description. Donetsk direction. On the 20th of May, Wagner's chief, Yevgeny Prigozhin, confirmed that his troops had captured Bakhmut, ending the 9-month battle for the city. Indeed, the town's capture is the greatest Russian victory since July 2022. However, Bakhmut in itself does not represent much strategic value, and the prospects after its capture looks bleak. The Russians in Bakhmut occupy the lowlands, and any movement towards Chasiv Yar will involve an uphill struggle against Ukrainian fortifications to the west of Bakhmut. Operationally, the fall of Bakhmut changes little. Meanwhile, the force that had captured the city, the Wagner Group, is now leaving. According to reports, Wagner is already being rotated out of the city and replaced by elements of 2 Russian airborne divisions, based on an assessment by the British Ministry of Defense. It is still unclear what Wagner's next move will be. The organization is expected to reappear in other parts of the front line. Yet while Wagner's untrained convicts and other personnel were more suitable for urban operations, their utility in open terrain without armored vehicles will be put to a tougher test. It is no great secret that both sides came out of this battle badly wounded. Suffice it is to say that Ukrainian losses in the town in February alone were in the region of 3,000 to 4,000 men. Rochan's insight tells us that Ukraine has no problem with manpower. The problem is access to artillery ammunition. Kyiv was bogged down in the fighting, which could affect its ability to maintain adequate artillery ammunition during the counteroffensive. But Kyiv remains confident. According to Serhiy Cherevaty, spokesman for the eastern group of the Ukrainian armed forces, the Ukrainian forces in the direction of Bakhmut have achieved their main objective. The Ukrainians exhausted the Russians and killed many of Wagner's soldiers. They also forced Wagner to flee the city, while Ukrainian forces continued to carry out attacks against the group. Cherevaty added that the troops coming to replace Wagner were not very motivated. Nevertheless, the Ukrainian also said that the Russians had increased the pace of artillery attacks to cover the rotation of their forces in Bakhmut. Apart from the fighting for Bakhmut, the overall situation in the Donetsk region remained largely unchanged and relatively stable. Fighting continued along the entire front line, but the Russian and Ukrainian ability to tip the balance in their favor did not materialize. It is worth noting that the Russians destroyed the dam of the Karlivka reservoir with an S-300 missile, exposing Haletsynivka, Zielone Persze and Zielone Druche to flooding. So far, the impact on the movement of Ukrainian forces in the area appears limited. In addition, the Ukrainians most likely launched limited counterattacks near Vuhledar. Russian sources claim that they attacked towards Volodymyrivka and managed to advance to recapture up to 18 square kilometers. They also entered Mykilski Dahi, forcing the Russians to retreat beyond the Kashlagach River, southwest of the settlement. Zaporozhye direction. A brief reminder, the description relates to events prior to June 7, 2023. The past period has again proved relatively stable in the Zaporozhye region. Russian concerns about the impending Ukrainian offensive fluctuate, but continue to be loudly heard. According to one report, 65,000 troops have already been deployed 80 to 100 kilometers from the front, including 2 army corps and airborne units. We have not been able to confirm the accuracy of these reports, but the numbers are probably close. Another source, Rybar, reports that the group has around 50 to 55,000 troops. On the other hand, the Ukrainian Military Intelligence Service claims that some 152,000 Russian troops are deployed in the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions. The service has not recorded any withdrawal of Russian troops from these two regions. The intelligence service also noted that the so-called evacuation of citizens living near the front line was in fact a counter-intelligence and filtering exercise aimed at limiting the number of residents who could provide the Ukrainian army and security services with information on the movements of Russian forces in Kherson and Zaporozhye. According to Ivan Fedorov, the Ukrainian mayor of Melitopol, Russian forces continue digging trenches large enough to house equipment on the outskirts of Melitopol. He also said that Russian troops are hiding equipment and personnel in the Bohatyr forest and using trees to build additional fortifications. He added that residents of the city report that many military trucks loaded with trees are moving along the ring road towards the front line in Zaporozhye. Ukrainian forces have again attacked Berdyansk, possibly using Storm Shadow cruise missiles. It is not clear what the target of the attack was, but the repeated attacks on the city suggest that these are high-priority targets. On the other hand, according to Vladimir Rogov, an occupation official in the Zaporozhye region, Ukrainian artillery hit the TO8-17 road between Vasilivka and Dnipro-Rudne on the 30th of May. He also reported that Ukrainian forces shelled Mikhailivka on the same day. These attacks may be aimed at clearing the way for Ukrainian units to reach the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Kherson and Crimea direction. On Tuesday, 6th of May, the dam on the Dnieper at Nova Kakhovka was destroyed. For the record, due to the speed of events, the analysis of these events does not come from Rochan, but from our own sources and observations. Both sides blame each other for the destruction of the dam. The Kremlin claims that the Ukrainians blew up the dam with artillery fire, which would have been extremely difficult, if not impossible. On the other hand, it was widely discussed that explosives planted by the Russians had been inside the structure of the dam for several months. The dam was under Russian control from the early days of the war and until it was breached, while the risk of it being blown up was discussed during the Ukrainian offensive last year. On November 11th, there was an explosion at the dam, but the structure retained its structural integrity. A dam breach through the deliberate accumulation of critically high water levels is also possible. Satellite imagery shows that the road running along the dam was breached 3 to 4 days earlier. But this changes nothing in terms of the responsibility for the event, which still falls on the Russians. According to Ukrainian journalist Olga Tokariuk, quote, "Blowing up of Kakhovka Dam will have far-reaching and long-standing consequences for Ukraine. Some of the most fertile lands will become a desert. Ukraine's agricultural sector will be badly hit. People will leave those lands because of lack of jobs, climate, environmental change." Unquote. Operationally, blowing up the dam has significant consequences for both sides. The Russians' main objective was to delay the Ukrainian counteroffensive and make it more difficult to land across the Dnieper. The Kremlin is counting on the fact that even after the waters recede, the mud and swamps will make the area impassable for heavy equipment. This will allow Moscow to shorten the front line and strengthen the Zaporozhye direction at the expense of Kherson. However, the terrain elevation means that most of the wetlands are on the left bank of the river, that is Russian-occupied territory. So the Kremlin seemed willing to destroy the dam at the cost of losing its own fortifications in Kherson and the minefields, most of which were flooded. Every stick has two ends. By blowing up the dam, the Russians effectively sealed the fate of Crimea, which was cut off from water. The Crimean Canal used to draw water from the Kakhovka reservoir. but after the breach, the water began to flow backwards. The Kremlin is thus delaying Kyiv's counteroffensive main thrust, but at the enormous cost. Not just environmental, but potentially strategic, of losing Crimea and the entire left bank of the Dnieper. Estimates of how long the Kherson region will be impassable vary, ranging from a few weeks to a few months. Still, the impact of blowing up the dam will be measured in decades, and could have disastrous strategic consequences for the Kremlin. Moscow's cold calculation could also result in depriving Ukraine of one of its critical infrastructure objects for years to come, before Russian troops withdraw. If we don't have it, no one will, type of thinking. In this context, the risks for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant are also growing. On the other hand, the disaster could provide pressure and motivation for the West to strengthen Kyiv's offensive capabilities further. Moments after the event, the commander of Combined Armed Forces of Ukraine, Serhiy Nayev, reported that, quote, "the blowing up of the dam in Nova Kakhovka will not harm the offensive of the armed forces of Ukraine." The command had anticipated such steps by the occupiers, unquote. Now a step back from events in Ukraine and Russia. The situation in Belarus remains calm. Apart from reports of Lukashenko's deteriorating health, the main news remains the fact that Minsk and Moscow have signed an agreement on the deployment of nuclear weapons in Belarus. The Belarusians were to carry out exercises with the Iskander system, presumably with the aim of handling nuclear warheads. Kyiv's long-awaited decision to transfer F-16 fighter jets to the Ukrainians has also been made. There is no doubt that when Ukraine receives 40 to 60 F-16s, they will provide Kyiv with a major additional capability. However, they will unlikely appear in Ukrainian skies until the fourth quarter. Australians are also considering giving Ukraine their retired Fa-18 Hornets. Ukraine is ready for a reconquest of lost lands, as the current operations in Zaporizhzhia confirm. Time will tell if this is already a main push by the Ukrainian armed forces. We will be sure to report on these developments in the next episode of Mapped series. Recently I had a meeting with a YouTube analyst, and she suggested that if I want the channel to grow, I should ask our audience for feedback to help boost the algorithm. So if you liked this material, please press the thumbs up button or write a comment. You may also consider supporting us on Patreon.